I thought that we could discuss perhaps a few different themes together that are not limited to Egypt or even the modern Middle East. So things like the construction of narratives and counter narratives, the circulation of information and misinformation, and then the promise, peril, and power of media technologies. All of those ideas, I think we have a tendency to connect to a single mass medium, that medium being the internet. And this is something that's not all that surprising. We are bombarded by headlines like the ones on the slide here on a fairly regular basis. The tendency to tie all of these ideas to the internet is something that's also readily evident in the field of Middle East studies, where scholars have written at length on social media, especially in relation to the Arab Spring, the mass demonstrations that shook the region now over a decade ago. So if we have a quick survey of scholarship here, we see publications on Facebook, Twitter, other online platforms have really replaced work on Al Jazeera, the transnational satellite network, as the subject of choice for many studies on the region's media. And although these works offer key insights into the intersections of authoritarianism, activism, contemporary politics, they also lend the impression that only the most recent media matter when it comes to the Middle East. So in the spirit of expanding the parameters of this body of work, and thinking about what a seemingly obsolete technology can teach us about a now omnipotent one, we're going to be talking about cassette culture today. Before introducing my book and one of its chapters, I thought I could start with how this history came to be, the origins of this project in the first place. So those could be traced back to my time in Egypt, a week after receiving my BA in Arabic, Middle East, and Islamic Studies. I flew from North Carolina to Cairo for an intensive Arabic fellowship that just so happened to coincide directly with the 2011 Egyptian revolution. So I was taking classes in downtown Cairo at the old American University, which is directly on the border of Tahrir Square. So something that I always tell my students in isolated New Hampshire, where I'm teaching now, that if you looked out the window, rather than seeing this idyllic green with one car driving by, if you saw a million people calling for the overthrow of a 30-year repressive regime, that's what we saw during that fellowship. So here are some photographs that I took of a number of scenes that came to characterize the uprising in the eyes of many people. So there are pictures of powerful graffiti. We have these colorful murals, these signs, these public performances. Something that's of note with this upper right image is that this was the wall of a building off of the square, which became the focal point of the revolution, turned into this mural. And this particular drawing right here, I snapped a photograph of it, did one loop of the square in about 15 minutes, came back, and it was entirely painted over, whereas other murals were allowed to stay up. One of the reasons for that is this mural depicts not only the riot police in Egypt brutalizing Egyptians, but also the military doing the same thing in the first week of the revolution. And that was considered something that was to be unacceptable. So this might be the only enduring image of that mural, which I think raises intriguing questions about archives and how are we to write a history of something like a revolution. So while all of these scenes were quite striking and made an impression on me, something that I soon came to realize was sound, in addition to sights, were playing a pivotal part in what was taking place around me. So to give you an idea of some of the sounds that I encountered during the revolution and the days leading up to Hosni Mubarak's downfall, I thought I would play part of two of the videos that I took. So in the first video here, we see protesters ordering a helicopter to leave as it hovered overhead in a failed show of force. In the second video here, we're going to see men, women, and children calling for the fall of Mubarak. For this clip, this might only be about 8 seconds long. We could see people flooding into Tahrir Square. I could have filmed there for hours and that crowd would not have let up. Just to give you an idea of the size, the sheer multitudes of people pouring into the square, participating in the revolution. One thing just to note about these videos that I often tell my students is I find them to be important primary sources, not only in terms of giving us a better idea of what happened at one point in Egypt's past, but also trying to counter the Egyptian government's attempts in this very moment to rewrite the revolution. So I see these materials playing multiple roles. Once returning to the US for grad school in a far more quiet Ithaca when I left Cairo, I dove more deeply into Egypt's soundscape, its historic soundscape. So I ended up writing papers on particular artists, on musical genres, on religious currents. And when it came time for the dissertation, one thing that I realized was there was a single thread that connected all of these topics. And that thread was cassette technology. So that realization then led to this book, Media of the Masses, which offers a multisensory history of modern Egypt through the window of the country's cassette culture. The book's contributions, I would say, are really fourfold. So first, it makes a case for taking sound and the senses seriously as an avenue of inquiry. People in the past, much like we're doing right now in this room, apprehended the world around them through all of the faculties at their disposal. So something this book makes an argument for is for exploring sound in a critical and a creative manner. Likewise, I would say the book also reorients many treatments of media and popular culture, especially in Middle East studies, where we have that tendency to focus exclusively on social media. So this project looks at the social life of an earlier technology, cassette tapes and players. At the same time, with respect to popular culture, we have a number of works that center on state-sanctioned performers, artists who were endorsed by ruling regimes. One of the perhaps unintended consequences of that scholarship is scholars, us, have assigned the same importance to people who were deemed important by those in positions of power. So in this work, I place state-sanctioned artists into conversation with other voices who challenged political, cultural, and religious authorities. And I think the outcome of that is a more expansive engagement with Egyptian culture, and one hopefully that also invites us to think about how can popular culture not only complement what we already know about the past, but can really radically reorient what we think we know about history. The final contribution is to the archive. And so this project looks critically at archives and the stories that they enable us to tell about the past. So in the case of Egypt, several obstacles from the inaccessible National Archives. The Egyptian National Archives end in 1952. So this project is on the 70s until the present day. You cannot gain access to anything there. You have missing documents. You have restrictive research clearances. Historical research in Egypt now is a matter of national security. And so one of the questions that this book asks is, what about the opportunities that are inspired by those obstacles? How can we really expand the material horizons of Middle East historiography? How can we write a history of a nation without its national archives? Is something that I consider in the course of this project. And for me, that's something that's not sort of just some intellectual exercise. I think it's also personally and politically important because we currently have a regime in Egypt that's trying to monopolize the past in the present. So I think it's incumbent upon us as scholars to also counter those efforts. One of the sources that's at the center of this project is the state-controlled Egyptian press. So I look at two leading weekly magazines, which covered a wide array of political, cultural, economic affairs during the final 3 decades of the 20th century. We see here a screenshot from one of the albums in my iPhoto library, which contains perhaps around 10,000 pictures, each of which I've tagged with keywords. So we'll see things like the font's very small, but electricity, complaint, noise pollution, sound, customs, Port Said, all of these different topics. If my computer ever crashes, that's going to be a problem, speaking of archives. But in addition to things like editorials, advertisements, court cases, crime reports, celebrity news in these magazines, I also rely upon sources outside of the press as well. Things like films, memoirs, declassified documents, interviews that I conducted, social media posts, personal photographs, family albums that have disintegrated over time that I found in garbage bags and paper markets and had to piece back together again. And then also cassettes, the sleeves that contained cassettes, the writing on the tapes, the recordings on the tapes, and then the places that continue to contain them in present-day Egypt. So we see two of those settings here. The one on the left is a cassette label no longer. It's become an electronic shop. And so you would go there today. This is a little kiosk in a wall, not much wider than this, me to the curtain perhaps. And they sell extension cables, television remotes. But when you walk in, one of the things that you immediately notice is that the entire left wall is comprised of cassette tapes from floor to ceiling. And this is maybe just one corner of that wall. Here we have an antique trailer or an antique shop that's in Zamalek, a more upscale neighborhood in downtown Cairo. These cassettes were buried in the back of it. I started to catalog them one afternoon. I returned the next day. They had entirely vanished. And so, which was less than ideal from the perspective of a researcher. And so these are some of the material traces of cassette culture that continue to linger all the way up until this very moment in Egypt. So all of these materials, the magazines, the films, the photographs, the cassettes, all of these things converge into what I call Egypt's shadow archive, an archive that exists in the shadow of the inaccessible Egyptian National Archives that enable us to tell different stories about the past, and also to challenge the attempts of those to police the past and the present. In terms of the book structure, this is something that, an idea that arrived to me quite late in the project, but one that I enjoy. It's organized as a cassette tape, as a mixtape. So each chapter revolves around a particular idea. This is why I said that I like thematic projects earlier. So one of the chapters, it goes from basically the study of consumption to the law, to the creation of culture, to circulation, to history, to archives. The project also then features 2 different sides to it. So side A of a cassette, or part 1, is all about the making of Egypt's cassette culture. And then side B, or part 2, is about the impact of cassettes and their users on the creation of culture, the circulation of information, and the writing of history. I would say the book advances 2 main arguments. So one of them is cassette technology and its diverse users. The technology really enabled an unprecedented number of people to create culture and circulate information long before the internet ever entered our daily lives. So here we have a technology decentralizing state-controlled media decades before Al Jazeera and before social media platforms. The second argument, which is broader than that, is saying that media and the stories that media technologies tell can assist us in re-envisioning the making of modern nations. So in this book, I explore how cassette technology enables us to discuss everything from the making of the modern home to the forging of black markets to the material impact of migrant workers, all subjects that at first glance seem like they have little or nothing to do with cassette technology. One of the things that I hope to show in doing that is how we as scholars can do more with media in our research and then also in our teaching. With respect to the different chapters here, so chapter 1 prioritizes the outward appearance of a very robust commercial arena. That's a chapter where I talk about leisure. I talk about the oil boom in the Middle East, but from a cultural history angle. Chapter 2 looks at some of the inner dynamics of that commercial space. This is where I explore what I call the criminal biography of cassette technology. So I look at two practices, smuggling and theft. Smuggling became a very popular practice in the 70s. We had an unprecedented number of Egyptians going to the Gulf and then bringing things not always legally back with them into Egypt. And one of the things I discussed in that chapter is this idea of an economy of desire that takes off. Cassette culture in Egypt coincides with the dawn of mass consumer culture. Both of those things happen at the same time. Chapter 3 then explores the creative power of cassettes. I talk about popular music, this new genre that takes off courtesy of the technology. Chapter 4 is about their circulatory potential. So this is all about copyrights and piracy. Chapter 5 then looks at what happens when these two things come together. In the case of a single artist who ends up challenging the stories that the Egyptian government is telling to the people. Chapter 6 then is about those material remnants of this once lively cassette culture. That chapter combines ethnographic and historical methods. One of the inspirations for that work actually is going to be a guest here this upcoming week on Monday, I think, Eric Tagliacozo. I overlapped with him at Cornell. And so his approach to different historical elements also inspired my approach to cassette remnants in that chapter. I'm more than happy to talk about any of these chapters in greater depth if they pique anyone's curiosity, but I thought just to offer a glimpse into the project, I would focus on the chapter bolded in blue here. So that chapter is going to revolve around a single historical event. This year is actually the 50th anniversary of that event. And it's also relevant to contemporary politics in the US at least too. Richard Nixon's visit to Egypt in the summer of 1974 when Watergate was unfolding in the US. So, and what is regarded as one of the warmest receptions an American president ever received overseas, Richard Nixon landed in Cairo on June 12th, 1974. So here we see Nixon on the right, standing next to Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, in front of the pyramids at the time. Egypt was the first stop on a 5-stop tour around the Middle East that was all designed and kind of billed as this tour for promoting peace across the region. This trip also presented Nixon personally with this very valuable opportunity to bolster his image abroad. So for Sadat, too, it served as an opportunity to strengthen U.S.-Egyptian relations. And from the minute that Nixon landed in Egypt to the moment that he departed, every single aspect of his visit was very closely documented. So we had state-controlled Egyptian media publicize every single thing from a phone call that Nixon placed at one point to the color of the mosquito net that was covering his bed in his hotel, because apparently that was a newsworthy item that people were just desiring to know at that time. For anyone wondering, the color of that net was green. Despite the brevity of this trip, which lasted only 3 days, Nixon and Sadat managed to cover immense ground together. So they paraded around Cairo, Alexandria, the greater Nile Delta, prior to confirming this mutual desire for closer economic, political, and cultural relations. On the eve of flying to Saudi Arabia, that was Nixon's next stop, Egypt's great guest invited his heroic host to come to the White House. Less than 2 months later, before Sadat ever had a chance to make that visit, take Nixon up on that invitation, Nixon resigned as a result of Watergate on August 8th, 1974. So what Nixon's trip lacked in time, it really made up for in spectacular moments. And in this regard, the president's arrival in Cairo is particularly instructive. Before Nixon even landed, the Egyptian government took several steps to ensure that his first encounter with Sadat was properly staged. So they shut down the entire airport. They adorned the runway with a literal red carpet. They assembled an honor guard for this 21-gun salute to greet Nixon as soon as he stepped off the plane. And then once Nixon did so, Sadat personally escorted him to this jet black Cadillac that we see on the slide here. This is an image from the procession from Cairo Airport to this palace that Nixon would be staying in downtown Cairo. So this convertible, as you might imagine, was a security nightmare, but it served as a platform for the two heads of state to stand side by side and to personally greet the Egyptian crowds as they drove by them. This car was one of nearly 200 that was the size of this caravan that was moving from the airport. And this motorcade, it moved very slowly. So it took around an hour to traverse less than 7 miles in the scorching sun. And the reason that it did this was to prolong these greetings with the people in the streets. As was the case with the Cadillac Speed, its course was also deliberate. So it traveled down highways that had been recently straightened by bulldozers in Cairo. And then it passed under archways adorned with these banners that read things like, "We trust Nixon," and all these proclamations that were erected especially for this occasion. And this procession was far from silent. So we had onlookers shouting things like, "We believe in Nixon," and "Welcome to a man of peace" in Arabic. And then we had sound trucks outfitted with loudspeakers that were blaring chants in English with "Long live Sadat" and "Long live Nixon." We had men playing wooden flutes. We had a band of children on the slide here performing curbside. We had horns greet the dignitaries at their final destination. And all of these sounds led one reporter to proclaim that the noise surrounding Nixon in Cairo made Aida look like an off-Broadway revue. Nixon's arrival begins to capture some of the key aspects of his welcome. First and foremost, the procession illustrates the importance placed by the Egyptian government on planning his greeting, which extended far beyond the production of signs to the presentation of awards to the establishment of an official office to coordinate the president's popular reception in Egypt's capital. At the same time, Nixon's welcome was not limited to Cairo. So at a distance from the capital, his reception was no less awesome. On the morning of June 13th, the very next day, the presidents embarked on a second procession that came to constitute another key chapter in the official story of Nixon's visit. Leaving behind roads for rails, the presidents boarded a train bound for Alexandria. Standing once more at Sadat's side, Nixon rode in a special open-air coach that provided its passengers and then nearby crowds that we see on the right here with unimpeded views of one another. Like the airport motorcade, this train was in no rush. So it strategically slowed at multiple stations where you would have crowds of Egyptians on the platform greeting the presidents with signs, banners, flowers, releasing flocks of doves as the train slowly went by. And we have these images that serve to index what this experience was like. So in this one here, we see Nixon kind of in the middle there, smiling as a series of soldiers prevent cheering onlookers from coming too close to the tracks. And another shot here, we see Nixon joyously leaning over the car's railing as one Egyptian man is waving with his arms high above his head. One thing to notice here is what Egypt's president Sadat is doing in this photo. So we see Sadat here staring directly into the camera, posing. And a third photo, we have a banner proclaiming "We Trust Nixon" in English atop a makeshift stand in the foreground, while we have welcome signs in Arabic and English in the background, along with a series of mass-produced black and white posters that are hard to make out here, but they're the faces of Sadat and Nixon that are lining that entire building in the background. The origin of all three of these photographs is the train car carrying Sadat and Nixon. Documenting what Nixon saw and heard was a key part of this staging and this scripting that was being carried out by the Egyptian government over the course of his stay. Outside of the train station then in Alexandria, we had another parade, triumphant archways, this scene that by now was a very familiar one to Nixon and to Sadat. All of this fanfare would inspire Nixon Baba, or Father Nixon, this contemporary song that directly challenged the Egyptian government's official story of this sonorous spectacle. But before we unpack that informal response, I first want to introduce the voice behind it, the artist. So Sheikh Hammam, for those of you who might not know him, was born in the summer of 1918, a year before the 1919 revolution in Egypt, in a small village outside of central Cairo, where he lost his sight shortly after birth to a rural medicine that was administered by his mother to cure an eye infection and accidentally blinded him. Like other local children, he learned how to recite the Quran at a young age. He enrolled in a kotab, and he ended up memorizing the Quran by the time that he turned 12. Sometime later, he left his hometown for Cairo to continue his Islamic studies. But Imam's religious education in Egypt's capital was not destined to last. So the administrators at his Islamic Institute dismissed Imam for listening to the Quran being recited over the radio, a technology at the time that they viewed as a gateway to unbelief and immorality, irrespective of what the radio was broadcasting, even in this case, when the radio was playing Quranic recitation. When Imam was dismissed from the Islamic Institute, he was also living at that institute. So he became homeless, and he ventured to this nearby working class neighborhood where he proceeded to scrape out this living by singing and reciting the Quran in local houses and stores, religious festivals, different celebrations. It was during one of those performances that he piqued the attention of a leading music instructor who invited him to be his student. And it was at that point that Imam learned how to play the oud. This is when he adds that to his musical arsenal. And then he would go on to commit himself to his art on a full-time basis by 1945. The next major turn in his trajectory is going to happen in 1962, when he crosses paths with the gentleman on the left on the slide here, Ahmed Fuad Nigam, and begins to set his colloquial poetry to music. So if Imam honed his craft prior to joining forces with Nigam, his voice spread by way of cassettes, carrying the poet's verses. In the absence of state-controlled Egyptian media, which refused to broadcast their critical collaborations, non-commercial cassettes, like the ones that we see on the slide here, enabled the duo to reach a wider audience. Throughout Sadat's rule, Imam's tapes were not available on the streets. They were not sold in stores. They were not recorded in professional studios. They originated at a distance from all of those venues. So people recording Imam performing at public protests, at demonstrations at universities, at the artist's apartment, and then pirating those tapes. And so here we have an instance where artists are actually encouraging piracy because that's how their music is circulating. And then non-commercial cassettes like these, where we see the handwriting on them based on who recorded them and who circulated them. These tapes enabled Imam's live performances, afforded them a degree of permanence. To give you an idea of some of the settings in which Imam was recorded, I'm going to play part of a grainy home video of one of his performances. And something that this video also confirms, this was recorded in 1991, so a few years prior to Imam's death in the mid-90s. It confirms the presence of cassette recorders all the way up to the end of his life. In his vicinity, we're going to see a boombox in the foreground recording him singing and playing the oud. So here is one of those shows.
Valérie Giscard d'Estaing.
So this is a short clip. You might have caught the name of a second president, someone other than Nixon at the very end of that. That's something that we'll return to later. So I'm not going to spoil that further for now. In some cases, individuals with a large collection of Imam's cassettes shared them with interested parties. And so one example of this is the family of Nur ad-Din al-Akkad, who was an Egyptian politician. He possessed most of Imam's tracks. He enjoyed personally a close relationship with the performer, and Imam would direct people to their informal collection. Once establishing a rapport with the family, then you could go to their house. This is in Maadi in Cairo, if anyone's been to Cairo before, and you could sit in their living room and copy the cassettes that they had copied from other people. The quality of these tapes, as you might imagine, was not necessarily always high. So we hear white noise or static in the background. This is something that would increase over time the more and more that you copied a tape. You hear personal conversations, you hear joking, you hear laughter, you hear drinking, you hear all these different things because they were recorded at house parties is where these cassettes originated. Nevertheless, these tapes managed to entirely evade state censors, move past cultural gatekeepers, and travel well beyond Egypt's national borders to across Europe, to the US, to a wide variety of places. As one artist recently explained to me, I'm writing a biography of Sheikh Imam right now, is the book that I'm currently working on. And one of the things that he told me, this is a project that relies in large part on oral history, is that Imam's tapes were available in Beirut during the Civil War. And you would go up to a kiosk in Beirut, and each kiosk would generate their own Sheikh Imam mixtapes, since there were no formal official albums coming from a recording label. So you'd walk up to a kiosk and you would ask for Imam number 1, or Imam number 2, or number 3, and it would vary by kiosk, and they would mix different songs together. And so that is just one of the places outside of Egypt where Imam was heard quite widely. And all of these regards with the informal production and the circulation of these songs, Nixon Baba, the song that we're going to focus on now, was no exception. But before diving into that song, I wanted to play part of it so you could actually hear Imam singing it. This is going to be the first verse at the top on the slide here. And I've just provided a translation of the whole song. The second half of it is on a slide that we'll get to next.
شرفت يا نيكسون بابا يا بتاع الوترجيت عملوا لك قيمة وسيمة سلاطين الفول والزيت شرفت يا نيكسون بابا يا بتاع الوترجيت.
Oh, and if you know the lyrics, you could sing along as well.
سلاطين الفول والزيت فرشوا لك أوسع سكة من راس التين على مكة فرشوا لك أوسع سكة من راس التين على مكة وهناك بنفد على عكا ويقولوا عليك حكي ما هو قول لي نايم نايم شلة يا أصحابي.
So as you can perhaps tell, Imam is having a pretty good time singing this song. That's him and Nigam and others laughing in the background. And one thing that becomes immediately evident here is Imam binding Nixon to this event that irreparably damaged his image, Watergate. So after opening with "Welcome, Father Nixon, O you of Watergate," the lyrics cleverly allude to Nixon's national woes on multiple occasions. Imam points to Nixon's now frail state. He comments on the possibility of him being no longer around. Unlike the crowds who shouted, "Welcome," the singer, well aware of Nixon's shattered credibility, refuses to greet him out of ignorance. In addition to spotlighting the president's political troubles back in the US, the song also offers a jarring counter-narrative of his local reception in Egypt. In one verse, Nixon's arrival assumes the form of a czar, or a ceremony for excising spirits in which Sadat, the devil, possesses the woman responsible for vanquishing him and leads the theatrical show. In his second verse, Nixon's welcome takes the shape of a wedding procession, or a zepha, in which the American president plays the part of a groom, one married as a last resort, a pathetic figure upon which Imam audibly spits as he's performing the song. Both of these scenes are part of a never-ending moulid, a chaotic celebration that's usually held in the honor of religious figures, as opposed to a politician's visit. All of this imagery was immediately intelligible to Egyptian listeners who encountered the verses on informal tapes, like the ones on the slide here. And as a result of these recordings, Nixon Baba, it appears, made quite a splash. So according to its artist, the song spread at the speed of lightning and surpassed their earlier collaborations. Faith Petrick, who's an American folk artist, she traveled to Egypt and wrote up a profile of Imam in 1980, and she lends weight to the tune's initial popularity. So one of the things that she says in her profile piece is that Nixon Baba became such a hit that people were singing it in the streets. Although it's difficult to confirm such claims, perhaps the most telling indication that this informal anthem may have been heard widely on cassettes was the Egyptian government's decision to arrest Nigam and Imam shortly after Nixon's visit. So here we have a confidential letter that I stumbled across entirely accidentally at the British National Archives that's addressed to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at the end of September 1974. So a couple of months following the visit, where we have a British embassy official noting that Imam and Nigam, along with their friend and fellow artist Muhammad Ali, were apprehended for smoking hashish. This charge was almost certainly spurious. As one of the diplomats observes in the now declassified reports, everyone assumes, and is probably intended to, that the real offense lay in their lampooning not just of the U.S., not just of the regime, but of the U.S. connection, Uncle Henry and all. This lampooning, no doubt, refers to Nixon Baba, which continued to wander on copied cassettes to such an extent that both the Egyptian government and foreign envoys were well aware of the recording and its famous blind singer. While it's hard to completely elucidate the immediate impact of Nixon Baba, the song's enduring resonance is something that is beyond any doubt. So videos on YouTube verify its longevity. And one clip that I'll play from 1984, this was the first year Imam was permitted to travel abroad in his entire life. One of the reasons for that is because this is after Sadat was assassinated. So he's only enabled to go abroad once that happens. He goes and performs before this boisterous audience in Algeria. And one of the things that surprises Imam is when he's on stage and he's singing, the audience is singing along with him, even though he's never performed before them before. One of the reasons for that is because of those informal cassettes that had made it to Algeria years before Imam could physically travel there himself. So here's a recording of that performance. So you may have noticed there that what prompts the audience to applaud is Imam spitting on Nixon, which we see and hear in the recording. More recently, we have a 4-year-old boy with a Levantine accent recite the song in a grainy home video. We have a full orchestra perform it with a choir at a cultural center in Alexandria. And we have Miriam Saleh, who's an independent Egyptian artist who grew up with Imam's music as a child. She sings an electro rock version of it. So here's a recording of that song remade.
شرفت اقسم بابا يا بتاع الوترجي عملوا لك كلمه وسيمه سلطين الفول والزين شرفت اقسم بابا يا بتاع الوترجي عملوا لك كلمه وسيمه سلطين الفول والزين فرشوا لك اوسع سكه من راس الدين على مكه فرشوا لك اوسع سكه من راس الدين على مكه وهناك تنزل على عكا ويقول على حكيت وهو مولد ساير داير شلا يا صحابي.
One thing to point out is that if you were to go on SoundCloud to find this song today, it has been heard over 1 million times. And so this is something that's been listened to quite widely. Another example of Imam's enduring resonance and the longevity of Nixon Baba as a song in particular is this Facebook screenshot. This is something that I came across quite recently on a popular page where we see an official photograph of Nixon's welcome. This is something that was printed in the state-controlled Egyptian press, but the caption, notably on Facebook, departs from the caption that was assigned to the photograph when it was originally published. So the caption at the top there reads, "The American President Richard Nixon's visit to Egypt in 74, for which Sheikh Imam sang, 'Welcome, Father Nixon, O you of Watergate.'" Despite the best efforts of Sadat's regime to control the official story of Nixon's visit, it could not prevent Nigam and Imam's Nixon Baba from becoming the spectacle's unofficial soundtrack. One thing that I'll just note is that this song, in many ways, has become the lasting memory of Nixon's trip. And following Nixon's resignation, the visit to Egypt was something that Sadat tried to actively forget. And in many ways, this song would not let him forget about it and countered that state-sponsored amnesia. So if you read, for instance, Sadat's autobiography, In Search of Identity, of Beth Anazet in Arabic, Nixon's visit, something that was afforded so much attention at the time that it happened, Sadat devotes a single sentence to it. And the only thing he says is that Nixon came to Egypt and it preceded this terrible whirlpool of political turmoil. He almost tries to write it out of history. whereas Imam Nigam's song keeps it in this historical record. So in many cases, the reappearance of Nixon Baba is part of Imam's wider resurgence as an artist, which has witnessed the return of his music in offline venues, the creation of associations to celebrate his legacy, and the founding of Facebook pages, SoundCloud accounts, and YouTube channels in his memory, all during the Arab Spring, where protesters even performed his music on the very first day, January 25th, of the revolution. They sang his songs in downtown Cairo. More recently, Imam's voice has also surfaced during other demonstrations, not in Egypt, but across the Atlantic. There's videos of protesters singing his songs in New York City, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza as recently as a couple of months ago. Together, all of these performances and platforms evidence Imam's enduring resonance. And notably, as cassettes continue to disappear in Egypt, which is perhaps most visible in the case of these two photographs, where we see an entire cassette collection here at a kiosk that was in front of my apartment in Maadi in 2015. 4 years later, it entirely vanished. So as cassettes continue to vanish, one of the places where Imam's legacy endures is online, on those various social media platforms. And I think one of the questions that this raises for us as scholars is, what about materials currently online? Something that I'm reminded of here is the Library of Congress's decision in the US to stop archiving every tweet. Will items online at the moment be available 50 years from now? Or will things as mundane as software updates or as momentous as technological breakthroughs render present sources inaccessible to us in the future? In short, how will we not only write the histories of unstable media, how will we write history with the very same media going forward? I don't necessarily have answers to those questions, but I find myself reflecting upon them. In the end, the productive power and the circulatory potential of cassette technology enabled people like Sheikh Imam not to simply criticize ruling regimes, but to vocally deconstruct the very stories told by them. Whether praising politically active youth and Return of the Students, another song, or holding the military and Gamal Abdel Nasser accountable for Egypt's devastating defeat to Israel in the '67 war, and two other songs, or mocking the promises of French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who visited Egypt the year after Nixon. That was the clip of that home video that we heard of in another song called D'Estaing. Imam harnessed audio tape technology to compose Egypt's history anew before a mass audience, undermining the state's dominant narratives of contemporary events on multiple occasions, decades before the internet ever entered our daily lives. And by challenging a ruling regime's hold on history, its performance, its production, its remembrance, Imam's tapes invite us to re-examine Egypt's historical record and the power dynamics at play in its construction. And notably, this challenge arrived long before things like Facebook and YouTube on this technology consisting of plastic, a few metal screws, and a magnetic recording reel. Ultimately, Imam is someone who embodied and emboldened oppositional politics by lending a voice to ordinary people, ridiculing foreign leaders, taking Egypt's rulers to task. He confronted political authorities and the tales spun by them. In doing this, Imam is someone who found an especially attentive audience in the Egyptian left and the Arab left more broadly during a time of Islamic revival. And so something that fascinates me is that this period in the modern Middle East past, where it's so much about the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism and the Islamic revival and piety, here we have someone called Sheikh Imam who's singing against the government. It is an icon of the left and allows a very different story to be told about that period. So Imam played a key part in keeping the flame of resistance alive among leftists against the backdrop of the Islamic revival. And this feat, I think, was all the more impressive because he did not have access to the same national platforms as his peers. So unlike if we've heard of Kulthum, who's known as the voice of Egypt, the state-sanctioned star, Imam never had the luxury of requesting that one of his songs be played less often on state-controlled Egyptian radio. He was never heard on state-controlled Egyptian radio. So his songs index political dissent in a time of authoritarian rule and call attention to the contestation of power rather than its consolidation. In navigating the writing and rewriting of Nixon's visit to Egypt 50 years ago, I think several bigger questions come to mind. How may historically rigorous accounts of mass media assist us in reimagining the making of modern nations? What is the future of everyday technologies as an avenue of intellectual inquiry in and outside of the Middle East? And how may popular culture not only confirm what we already know about the past, but may fundamentally alter what we think we understand quite well about it? The answers to those questions, I think, promise to enhance not only our understanding of Middle East history, but also the construction of narratives, the circulation of information, the power of technology more broadly. So concluding with one of this talk's central characters, Anwar Sadat was no stranger to the scripting and rescripting of Egypt's past. He penned two different iterations of his autobiography. So on the left here, the first version, Safat Mashhula, or Unknown Pages, this is an autobiography that ceased production after Sadat became president in 1970. Following that event, we then have a second autobiography that comes out on the right, Beth and Azet, or In Search of Identity, that frames Sadat in a more heroic light than the earlier texts. These competing publications, I think, brilliantly underscore Sadat's attempts to not only secure, but also to rethink his place in Egypt's history. They capture the very dynamic nature of the historiographical enterprise. Unlike Sadat's In Search of Identity, however, it's safe to say that Nigam and Imam's Nixon Baba was not a revisionist history of which Sadat would approve. The construction of Egypt's past from the perspective of its ruling regimes was not an activity to be undertaken by just anyone. Final note here, I thought I'd very briefly highlight some things that I'm currently working on. So another project is going to be a transnational history of record culture that will move from the late Ottoman Empire up until the present day, where we see early 20th century Arabic records, vinyl records, are being remixed in places like European clubs and finding new audiences. So this project will draw on everything from personal libraries in the Gulf to museum holdings in the US, and it will intervene in conversations on colonialism, cultural heritage, gender. Then we also have this project. This is the biography of Sheikh Imam. I'm going to be writing this one for a popular, more general audience. And it's going to intervene in discussions of activism, misinformation in a pre-internet era, and then the making of the modern Middle East more broadly. Something just to note about these two images is this is the obituary that a leading state-sanctioned paper prints for Sheikh Imam following his death. This is the notice. So it's below this advertisement for an air conditioner set, for Swiss timepieces, for other material objects that appear on the page. And it basically says, Sheikh Imam passed away on this day. He was suffering from diabetes. He sang critical songs and he won an international award. It's 2 sentences long. That obituary enraged followers of Sheikh Imam, people that enjoyed listening to his music, so much so that they submitted an obituary the very next day that the paper reprinted. This is just a screenshot of part of it, where we have something like 150 signatories cascade down the entire page of the paper. Sheikh Imam is referred to as an artist of the people here. So even in death, much like his life, we see this idea of writing and rewriting that continues to happen. And then, as was mentioned earlier, the book will be coming out in Arabic in a couple of months, which was a dream of mine because I also wrote this to be read by Arabic readers and speakers in the region. So a publishing house in Egypt will be releasing it. And these are some of my cassettes at home. So I have a few hundred tapes. I'll be digitizing all of them. I'm going to be working with students on that. And then I'll be making them all publicly available. Something to note with this project is that probably 70 to 80% of the content on these cassettes is not available on any streaming platform online. And so by digitizing the tapes, it's also a way of, in a sense, repatriating them to a global audience where people can hear them again or hear them for the first time in many cases. That's it. Thank you.